So, you've been assigned to teach public speaking. It's not essay writing, and it's not theater. We want to make the experience as beneficial for our students as possible. We want them to leave our classroom empowered, inspired, and confident in their skill sets. But who has the time to read research and go to workshops? That's where I come in. My name is Julian, and you're listening to the Public Speaking Educators Forum. This podcast is for educators who teach public speaking. Each week, you'll hear from a fellow instructor who has an interesting trick to the trade to share with you. We are speaking up so that you can help your students to speak up too. Tonight on the forum, we'll be speaking with Professor Gary Braman. Professor Braman is Professor Emeritus of Media, Communication, and Technology at East Stroudsburg University in Pennsylvania. During his 30-year tenure, Professor Braman taught courses in graphic design, photography, and educational media. In many of his courses, he taught Microsoft PowerPoint. Being as visual aids are often a required aspect of the general education course in public speaking, Professor Braman will share some pointers on the use of PowerPoint as a visual aid, but also some tools that any presenter should understand. Professor Braman, welcome to the forum.
Thank you, Julian. It's nice to be here.
Nice to have you. So we hear the word visual aid a lot. People meaning faculty, will encourage students or require them to use visual aids to aid a speech or presentation, but oftentimes when they say visual aid, they're really referring to Microsoft PowerPoint. So what I wanted to start was asking you is there a certain type of presentation where PowerPoint lends itself well to as opposed to maybe other types of presentations where you'd advise against using PowerPoint?
Well, I think PowerPoint is a good tool, but it's like any tool that you use, like a carpenter has his hammer. Just because he has a hammer doesn't mean he knows how to build a house. And so I think PowerPoint is a good tool, but we need to know how to use it, which I'm sure we're going to get into more depth later. But I think it's good for just about any presentation. You'll see it used in churches, like clergy uses it for their sermons, and of course educators have used it for years, and in business and industry they use it. So it's I think it's a good tool. It really helps with adding visuals to a presentation, making it more interesting, and rather than just having the spoken word. You can use it just for sprucing them up or for adding the information to it through the visuals. For one's presentations with that don't lend themselves well, I have a hard time thinking of any. Of course, demonstrations and how to do things. You can do some things like that with PowerPoint, but I think many times in a demonstration, you're much better off either doing it live or with a video that can show how to do kind of thing. I think that's about it for that particular question.
So when you teach students how to use PowerPoint to accompany a presentation, and I know you did this in your educational media courses, you were mainly dealing with teacher education majors, but certainly these principles can be applied to other areas as well. What were some of the pointers that you would stress when you talk about delivery of a presentation with a visual aid?
One of the main things is what to avoid. And there's a lot of lists out there of saying things that you shouldn't do. As far as what you should do, I think you need to integrate the presentation into your own regular public speaking. I think that it should augment it, but it shouldn't be the whole presentation. I think the most important part about doing any presentation is the presenter, him or herself, and what they put into it. And I think that that's still true. One of the problems with PowerPoint is that whenever you mention the name PowerPoint, lots of times it's like the kiss of death. People start going, oh no, not another PowerPoint. And they start falling asleep immediately. And it's not because PowerPoint's terrible. It's just that it's the way that it's either used or the way that it's been put together. And quite often, PowerPoints are just these long lists of information. And that's something that I would definitely avoid, having no visuals and just list after list after list. And you can lose an audience pretty quickly with that. So keeping away from that sort of thing. It has a lot of powerful tools that you can use, but just because they're there, I don't throw everything in that the PowerPoint can possibly do into the presentation. I think less is more in that particular case.
So, what about when you're teaching the actual delivery of presentations with PowerPoint? Now, we've talked a little bit about kind of the considerations as far as content on, we'll just say the slides for now, but what
Mm-hmm.
about actually the presentation itself?
Well, one of the main things you have to do is always be facing the audience. I mean, just good public speaking kinds of things, which I'm sure you have integrated many times in your classes. Always be facing the audience and don't be looking at the slides. You should know the slides pretty well. And don't bury yourself behind the computer. If you're using a desktop computer, for example, on a podium, I wouldn't be standing behind that. I think it's always better to be out front a little bit and not to cover up the screen either. You have to be careful of that sort of thing. And it's really good if you have a remote that you can use to advance the slides and to activate any types of pertinent animation that you may have on there. Anything like that would require the remote. I think that they're really handy. They can make a big difference.
So, in teaching how to use PowerPoint, you obviously stressed what should be put on the slides or what should be used as far as maybe effects, design considerations, and things like that, as well as how to deliver using these media. But obviously, we're also teaching software because PowerPoint is a software application, just like Prezi is also software, Google Slides, so on and so forth. And we'll stick to PowerPoint just for the purpose of this discussion. But which tools do you feel any presenter who's planning on using PowerPoint should know how to use in PowerPoint?
The basic tools I think are really essential to it. If you do have a list of items, for example, using progressive disclosure and just presenting one item at a time and not just throw them all up there at once. And animations, for example, can be really powerful, but they can also be distracting. It's just like any tool, they can be overused. And a nice animation can emphasize things, can bring the attention of a particular point to the audience. And I think that they can be used well. Sounds, that's a tough one. I think it's good to have a sound here and there and just to help augment the presentation. But for example, when you're presenting words, you can have a sound for every letter that comes up in your list, and that would be that's the kiss of death as well. People get really annoyed by that. I used to present that to the students of what not to do, and I would show an example of that. And I say, well, what do you think of that? Without question, they would all say that that's really terrible and distracting. So we have to be careful of those. There's a lot of other things too, like integrating a little movie here and there to illustrate something. That's a really nice tool as well. But you don't need a movie for every slide that you have. The main thing is that whatever effect that you're using, it should have a purpose. It should help the presentation, not distract from it. I think that's the main thing to be thinking about whenever you incorporate anything into the PowerPoint.
Now, as much as there is a science to presentation design, it's also an art form. And in a class like a public speaking course or maybe educational media, things like that, you can really only get into aesthetics so much because, you can't expect the students to be graphic designers or to be artists. So what is
Sure.
enough in terms of teaching aesthetics and just making students aware of that for for the design of their slides without turning the course into graphic design or message design?
That is a good question because a lot of us are not really good at artistic things. It's just not something that we're really good at. But I think having a basic list of things that can help, something to consider. Now, how many? That's your real question. I would limit it to certainly under 10, maybe more like five, something like that, of considerations to help with design tips and things that make sense to them and things that they can implement easily. I think that's where you're going with design tips. But that's a really important consideration because you want it to, the slide should look nice and professional because that reflects upon you, the presenter, because you want to be professional yourself, and that's a key to any presentation. And if you're using PowerPoint, you want to make it look like you knew what you were doing and that everything is, again, helping the presentation and not distracting from it.
Some things that come to mind to me just from my experience doing this, and I'm sure you share a lot of these experiences. If a student doesn't have an appreciation or maybe any experience in design and art, they tend to take a very minimalist approach, white background, black text, or they go the complete opposite and they have lots of color and all different fonts, and the text is bouncing and spinning and all this stuff. So I've always found that at least acquainting them to fonts and gradients are a great step. I mean, do you feel like gradients are something that students really need to understand just in terms of just a small touch that goes a long way?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's like not enough or too much. I think you need to find that middle ground. So with gradients are a tough one because they can make things look nice, but you have to be really careful with lettering, gradients and lettering. So for example, if you have a gradient, most of the time you use a gradient for a background. And the problem with many gradients is they go from a very dark color to a light color. And if you put lettering on top of it, if you choose a dark lettering, they're going to look great in the lighter part of the gradient, but you can't see it in the dark part, and vice versa. So you have to be really careful with them. You can, though, in PowerPoint, you can take the gradient and you can choose how light or how dark the gradient goes. So you could have a gradient, but not have extremes on the gradient, like not let it go real dark with the colors, or maybe not have it go to a complete white. So you can get an aesthetic look and still be able to read the lettering. That's, I think, a really important thing to be concerned with. Simplicity is really important. I think, like you gave an example of a student, doing bare minimum types of things on it. Because I think it's because they don't feel comfortable with using more complicated types of things with PowerPoint, or maybe they just don't have the aesthetic background, as you were mentioning before, to feel comfortable doing that. But I think just having the main things on the slide that you really need are important. Get your message across and have it clear to the audience, because that's your main goal in any PowerPoint presentation usually is the message. You want to make that clear. And if you have slides which are really complex, they can't focus on the message. And it's just a bunch of clutter, which I believe is that a word that you mentioned earlier? that's
No,
that's
but I think
about
it's very fitting, that's for sure.
yeah.
Another thing I've observed is that you'll give an example, you meaning the instructor, you'll give an example of how to design a slide. I usually try to walk through at least designing one or two slides in front of the class, and I'll choose a font, I'll create a gradient, I'll add slide transitions, things like that. And then the students will replicate exactly what I've done.
Yeah.
And semester after semester, I see a large number of presentations that look exactly like my example, down to the gradient, If maybe I used the color blue as my background. In fact, one semester
Yeah.
a student came up to me very nervous and she said, "Do I have to use blue as my background?" And I said, "Of course not." Would you say that a darker background is a better choice than a lighter background? Because these days you see both. I mean, I don't think there's a trend where people are predominantly using one or the other.
Yeah, I don't think you see one or the other as much either. It used to be with photographic slides, for example, you always had some color in the background with them because the white was so intense from the projector. But nowadays, with the computer images, I think you can get away with white. I've used it before, but you're going to have a lot of your necessary items on the slide so that it does kind of calm that white down. Maybe that's the way to go, is to have a background which is a color, but not have it too dark. I don't think it's good to have a really dark background. I think some color on it is okay to help cut down on the glare, because it can be visually fatiguing if it's too bright.
What I'll do sometimes, I'll throw a slide on the screen that has a bright yellow background and very thin red type. And I just watch my students squint and I say, "Do you like staring at this?" And they say, "No, get rid of it. Move to the next slide." And
Yeah,
I say, "Well, then
that's
there
it.
you go."
Yeah, that's really good. I think negative examples are really good, and bring it up to them, because audience participation is really good, and have them uh, make comments about it. It shows that they're involved and they're thinking about it. And I think that you can make your point so much better that way. So I think that works really good. So I support doing that. I always used to do that as well.
A lot of faculty members who teach public speaking do so in a regular classroom as opposed to a computer lab. So it's often, I guess you could say, suggested that they reserve a computer lab for a class meeting or two where they will either allow the students to work on their presentations, sort of with the instructor facilitating the process, or perhaps having a lesson plan with a tutorial on how to use different tools, maybe a handout or something like that. What are your thoughts on that process, of that piece of the public speaking course?
The first thing that you sparked in my mind when you mentioned it, and that is with PowerPoint. A lot of people do know how to use PowerPoint, or are at least familiar with it, have used it before. But there's a lot of people who have no idea how to really use it effectively. And going to the lab, I think, is a really good idea. And that's why I like to use, like you mentioned, tutorials. I always like to use tutorials and have them go through a tutorial, which allows them to use some of the things that they may not have used before. And also, if you can talk about what you've created amongst yourselves, like a critique kind of thing, you can kind of see what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's really important. It really leads to much better presentations, I think.
I'll ask you another question, kind of in a similar vein. How do you handle the student who comes to you and says, "Professor, I've been using PowerPoint since I was 5 years old," or "I'm majoring in computer information systems and I really don't need to be taught how to do this"? How do you, or "This tutorial, this is a little bit rudimentary for me"? How do you handle those types of students?
Well, uh, that's a tough one. I would say that's great. Glad you know so much about it. There's a couple different ways you could approach it. You could say, just to humor me, I would like you to, this ought to be easy for you. So let's see what you can do, and then let them do it. Most students like to be able to be successful and have an easy time at their assignments or their lab work. So you would think that they would go in there and say, well, this is easy. I'll just, go ahead and do it. Of course, the other element to this is that yeah, they've used it, but not necessarily in this context. And after all, you, the professor, are getting paid a lot to disseminate this information to help them. And if you're doing public speaking, for example, to help them with their public speaking so that they can be better at doing their presentations and be more successful at their jobs, whatever that may be. So you could also approach it that way too, and just tell them that that's why we're doing this, and I'm here to help you. I always think a good, honest approach is the best way. And if they still want to be scoochy about it, that's that's a common thing that you can always have a student that is like that in your class. I'd like to see the class that didn't have a student who didn't have some sort of opposition to something.
The next thing I wanted to talk to you about was how to assess PowerPoint, because obviously it requires a blend of technical understanding, it requires a creative energy or creative sensitivity, I guess we could say, but also how to use it in context of giving a presentation. So you're looking at a number of different variables, not just the slides themselves. So how do you assess a presentation that uses media?
Well, I think you've already hit it, and that is you have to look at the different elements of PowerPoint and the assignment, the presentation itself. So, as you mentioned, you have the technical aspects of it. How well can you maneuver around the program? Do you know how to use the tools and things like that? Does it make sense when it's integrated in there? The aesthetics of it, does it look nice? Is it attractive? Is it professional? You can also have a little checklist of your design principles that you gave them, your 5 principles or whatever that you used. And one of the main things is, how is the presentation using PowerPoint? Does it help the presentation or does it hinder it? And is it a good, interesting presentation? It's got to be interesting, because if you can't keep their interest, you may as well forget it. You may as well pack up the sneakers and hit the showers, because it's just not going to be effective. I think that's the most important thing is the effectiveness of it. Of course, the other thing is, when you're how you've integrated the PowerPoint into your presentation, and do you have student involvement, or I should say audience involvement, while you're doing it? Are you letting them participate and ask questions and things like that? Keep them involved. I think there are too many lectures where the presenter is just spewing out the information and then not letting the audience participate in it. And sometimes we think that we have such a vast amount of knowledge that everybody wants that knowledge. And sometimes that's true. But if you're in a public educational setting, that's not necessarily the case, because lots of times they can think of a lot more interesting places to be and to be spending their time with. So I think that being able to present it in a way that keeps them involved is very important.
And by and large, do you feel like students did well with this assignment?
Yeah, yep. I'm very pleased with my own personal experience going over PowerPoint. Even though most of them had done PowerPoint before, I didn't get too many people complaining that they already knew about PowerPoint and things like that. Of course, it depends upon the individual. Some people are more open than others, but most of them wanted to know how to do it well. And the examples that they came up with, I think, were really good. I think technically and aesthetically, and having a presentation which had good information and was interesting, and they involved the class, their audience, I think really worked out well. I was always pretty amazed at the types of things that they would come up with, actually. They would really rise to the occasion. I think a lot of them did it not just to get a good grade, but they did it because they wanted to do a good job, and to show that they could do it. And hopefully they would carry that on in their own work. That's why we teach, Julian. See see the good things that they do later.
Well, as much as I hate to say this, we are just about out of time. Professor Braman, it has been great having you here with us, and thank you so much for all of your advice and helpful tips on teaching PowerPoint. And of course, thank you all for listening to the Public Speaking Educators Forum. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and audible.com. Follow us on Twitter at PSEF Podcast, and be sure to tune in again real soon.